Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's an honor, special honor, to be able to greet you on behalf of the Embassy of Germany in Brasilia. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, good morning. It's a special honor to be able to greet you on behalf of the Embassy of Germany in Brasilia. First of all, I would like to thank our keynote speaker, Professor Janet Hoffman, and the other speakers. I would also like to thank the director of DAPP from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, Marco Rudiger, and thank you for organizing with us the week of webinars on fake news. Democracy talks to itself. It's the free trade of opinions. Only then, with pluralism, democracy can reach a consensus, and the internet offers huge opportunities. For the first time in history, all of the citizens can participate in the discussion without borders. On the other hand, the internet represents risks. It can destroy and put the democracy in risk, because discussions do not happen publicly in the public square anymore. It happens in the network. And sometimes the repercussion of fake news is disseminated. There's always been fake news, but in the internet, this propagates even faster. So what matters are those fake news on the internet. So that's why we need urgently new technical tools to preserve democracy, minimizing the risks. This week of webinars and the research project that we are launching has this subject. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that the opinions of the speakers do not necessarily represent the positions of FGV and the embassy, and it'll be published on the websites of the embassy and the foundation. We wait for a good discussion from everyone. Tomorrow we will have Catarina Valli, the Vice President of the European Parliament, and the journalist Patricia Mendes. The speakers of today are already on. Good. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tek Brevula, the Chief Correspondent of Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a newspaper in Germany. On the second part of the discussion, I'm going to be the moderator and I'm going to speak in Portuguese. I think this facilitates the communication when we have the discussion on the regulation of the internet and the political implications. The topic today is how disinformation affects the process of opinion making and the whole democratic process. Because of social media, we have new channels of communication that influence not only communication but the process of opinion making itself. Everybody participates in a massive communication media, or they are themselves a massive communication media, but we do not adopt the criteria that we adopted in the past. The selection criteria today are algorithms that select the messages, that filter the messages today. All citizens have the opportunity to take part in the public debate, but we verified that this also causes a few problems. Social media has become platforms that can be manipulated, or platforms that can manipulate. Platforms can disseminate lies, fake news, lies become truths. So media democracy may become another democracy. this process is dynamic. We don't know yet what repercussions that might have on the opinion-making process, and that is why it's great to have so many personalities in our webinar today. People who have worked this topic, have studied this topic deeply, and they can showcase to us what they have found out in their researches. I don't want to take a long time with my introduction. That is why I would like to pass the floor to our keynote speaker. She is a political scientist, professor. She teaches internet politics in the Free University of Berlin, and she also works in the Alexander von Humboldt Institute. She is the head of the political research group and digitalization. She is a consultant of the federal government and the European Commission, and among many other jobs. In summary, she is one of the most renowned people in Germany and in Europe as a whole when it comes to the topics of our webinar. And she knows Brazil really well. She is very well connected to the country. She has been here many times. So the floor is yours, Professor. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Now I would like to see if everything is working here and if I can introduce my presentation and share my screen showing you my presentation. I don't know if it is working correctly as it should. Let me check. Let's see if I can share my presentation with you. I think it's working now. The system is loading now. Okay, here it is. Can you all see it? Great. May I interrupt you? For all of the ones that are following us, you can ask questions. Then the questions are going to be asked during the discussion. There is a link on the page to ask your questions. So whoever wants to participate on the discussion, you can feel free to send your questions, okay? I would like to remove my image. Could you help me in this technical issue? I would like to remove my image from the screen and just leave the presentation. My topic is disinformation and democracy in the connected society. This topic concerns us very much in Germany, I believe, as much as you are concerned about it here in Brazil. We see different evolutions in different countries, and what is happening here in Brazil is happening in Germany as well. Our concern is that it will affect the core of democracy, so that the electoral campaigns are more and more debated on the internet, which means that the traditional rules will not apply anymore. What I brought to present on this topic maybe will disappoint some of you because my results, my conclusions are not so dramatic because of the way the situation is handled here. Last time I've been to Brazil, everything was very tense. On the cab and during the lectures, everybody was talking about WhatsApp, and people were saying that President Bolsonaro was elected because of the fake news on WhatsApp. In my opinion, this is too simplistic. It simplifies the discussion too much. That's why I cannot agree with it fully. That is why last year, when I was in Brazil, we had very interesting debates on the topic. What I would like to tell you is the political parties are not being elected anymore just because of WhatsApp. It has to do with many other factors. The Labor Party, PT, lost its strength. People wanted a change. So there are many issues that must be taken into consideration when it comes to social media during the elections. It's not only this they are not only means of communication. They are related to many factors, and of course, the social media can reinforce some trends, but they do not necessarily set the trends. This is an aspect. Another aspect is what we are observing right now, which is disinformation. Disinformation is a product of democratization and democratic systems that are currently under transformation. Without the democratization, the platforms would not have had the strength that they have. And platforms are used actively by people who want to occupy the public space, that want to participate and discuss. So, in my opinion, this is a visible and concrete result of democracy. Therefore, we cannot say that this alone will undermine democracy. We weaken the role of guardian of traditional media. We have new means of communication that are the product and the result of the democracy. And just for the introduction of this topic, now I would like to show you the structure of my presentation and what I'm going to approach on the next 20 minutes. First of all, I'm going to talk about the empirical results, the findings on disinformation. On the last few weeks already preparing for this event, I analyzed the whole literature to try to understand and put together what we know on disinformation and what is its effects. Then I'm going to establish a relationship. What is the relationship between disinformation and democracy? And before I finish, I will talk about the options of actions that we can employ. Let's start with the empirical findings. The first fact is that it is clear that there's a big discrepancy between the public speech on disinformation and what we observe from the empirical standpoint. This starts with the following issue. How disclosed is the phenomenon of disinformation and how many people are affected? If we want to follow public opinion, it seems that disinformation is so important that it practically dominates the whole public debate. But from the empirical standpoint, this was not verified. Besides, disinformation in the public speech and in the public debate is a lot clearer than when we look at the academic debate on the topic. This also has to do with related phenomena like the echo chambers, the social bots, the automatic messages. But if we look at the academic debate, these social bots do not have a single definition. There isn't a single method that allows us to define and distinguish people from social bots. Considering the procedures and their work and actions, social bots are a very strange phenomenon, and in the public debate, it seems that it's clearer and more defined than when we analyze it academically. The same thing applies to the echo chambers. In the public speech, it seems like everything is very well defined, and we only find those echo chambers on the margins of the society, like extremists, almost fascist margins of the society that are a bubble, that do not listen to the information from other groups, but it's not applicable for most of the population that, due to the internet, receives much more information from different channels. than in the past when we didn't have internet. At least in Germany, people used to watch the news on the television and they used to read some newspapers, at least the local newspaper. And we see here a decrease in the diversity of newspapers today. What I want to emphasize is that we have a discrepancy between the public perception and what we attest among researchers and scientists, and this needs to be considered. We have those phenomena like social bots and echo chambers, but this also applies to the causal relationships. These causal relationships are something that we can take from a result of the discussion yesterday. The relationship between social bots and the results in the media are very complex. It's very difficult to model that scientifically. This is our starting point. Let's talk about the most recent history of disinformation. I think we could start by taking a step back, because disinformation is not a new phenomenon. If we look at the history of the means of communication, mass communication, this has always existed. Usually we used to associate disinformation to the state propaganda. It always seemed like something that came from a bottom down approach. The state tries to manipulate people. It's a top-down approach, I'm sorry. But this has changed, especially with the creation of the internet. Disinformation started to be associated with what we call trolls. Who are the trolls? These are individuals, these are people who want to influence and subvert, undermine the discussion. They want to destroy the relationships in a discussion. In my international activity, I've seen this very much. There were discussions that happened internationally that were undermined because these trolls were able to get in the way of the debate and distort the debate, and the debate was finished. And consequently, the relationships got lost. It means that people can exclude people from discussions. Trolls are an old phenomenon on the internet, but they've gained a lot of importance in the recent past. Now let's look at the most recent developments. And this is going to be the topic of the second part of my presentation. We have a new phenomenon, which is disinformation as a service provision. Some companies are specialized in purchasing services and selling services of disinformation that other people can buy. The companies want to make money out of this. Of course, we can warn the platforms about this. We can complain. They are aware of this phenomenon. We have very dramatic headlines that are created to attract people, and with that you can increase your revenue with advertisements. This is the commercial side of disinformation. But there's also political disinformation in the international environment. We start with the mass communication media. The actors were at a state level, and now it already became a model of business. Companies offer as a service the generation of disinformation. and they put together disinformation campaigns to sell those services. Now we're going to see what is disinformation. In the public debate, I believe that this is also true to Brazil. We don't talk a lot about disinformation in the society, but we talk a lot about fake news and any kind of false information that is disclosed. People don't talk that much about disinformation, but everyone knows what fake news are. So how to distinguish them? In the academic debate, we have some papers, but there are not many. Literally, fake news can be understood as an attempt to disseminate false information, giving the idea that they are news to gain more credibility. So we have papers which are written, or they seem like headlines of newspapers, but they're not. We also have another intention with that kind of disclosure of false information. So I would like to add why we don't like the term of academic debates. First, fake news suggests that there are correct messages, true messages that portray the reality correctly. But we know that it's not always like this. There are always approximations, interpretations, and we should distinguish journalism, commentary, and the editorial part. And it is not that easy. We need to understand that there are fake and true messages. That is the first aspect. And the second aspect is fake news seem to have become a type of weapon in politics, starting with the election of Trump. What Trump doesn't like, for him, it's fake news. And that made the term fake news lose a little bit of its value. This is the third aspect. Fake news are associated with so many things that it was hard to know what it is exactly. That is why we scholars decided not to use that much the term fake news. We talk more about disinformation. However, even disinformation was not fully defined. We've had many attempts to define disinformation, and those definitions that are appearing, they include three aspects. Those are statements in which the person who speaks has the intention of manipulating people, disseminating fake news, false messages. And this is the distinction that we have between distorted messages and disinformation. Distorted messages are also wrong information, but those who disseminate them are not aware of it. They do not know that the information is not true. So the intention behind the message is the key aspect. So it is about trying to mislead people, deceive people, maybe because of commercial reasons or political reasons. So it is about strategically deceiving people for your own benefit. The other dimensions that you see on the slide have to do with disqualifying and influencing the domestic policy or foreign policy. It has to do with the format. It has to do with the text, image, and video. It seems that text is less efficient and less impacting than the images and the videos. The videos have the strongest impact, as we know very well on the research of the impact of television. So it is a lot stronger. Regarding the instruments, here we can see social bots, the software programs used for making messages more popular than they actually are, just because they have received a bunch of likes. Another aspect are electoral campaigns that are not directed to the public in general. They use some kind of sponsorship which is not transparent. They use resources, memes, which are popular and attractive, and they are simply replicated and disseminated, but not because of its content. Now we're going to see which are the unclear effects of disinformation. Studying the research on disinformation and considering the Brazilian case, we need to talk about the machine of disinformation, how the campaigns are structured, how the campaigns are put together, their multimedia aspect, the money that was invested, the WhatsApp groups that were created, how many messages, fake messages were disseminated. And it's very interesting and impressive. But the most difficult part is reaching a conclusion on what is the efficacy of knowing that this amount was invested to that purpose. The papers describe how that worked and how President Bolsonaro's campaign was structured, how many years before the campaign it was designed. But here we didn't find anything on the effect of those campaigns, the concrete effect of those campaigns. If we analyze the research on electoral campaigns in general, we know that the political parties spend a lot, especially in the United States. We have huge investments. So if we look at the effects, frequently the idea is the following. Political opinions and political behaviors are stable for long periods of time, and I'm going to get back to that in a second. And because of that, short-term effects like information and campaigns of disinformation have a relatively outlined effect. This is the position of science and research. There are some exceptions, but we have very few concrete empirical results. So we don't have evidence that can prove otherwise. But from a few years ago, we have a new research field, growing research field, where we do behavioral research in the laboratory. We place people in the laboratory and they have to watch videos and audios, and we try to measure how that influences those people, how the information in those campaigns influence people, and what kind of effects do those campaigns have in the people's brains. I understand that those studies in a laboratory scale can take us to conclusions regarding the influence in society. We still don't have, though, empirical evidence for such. What we have are effects on the right-hand side. Here we see trends of radicalization. and we can prove that. And we have an interaction on the recommendation of algorithms on YouTube, where and what effects it has on that audience. But this audience that is on this field already has this trend before.
Was to take conclusions about the society in general and the audience in general. So, what are the implications of these findings about the consequences of disinformation on democracy? This is the second part of my presentation. Now I try to describe the following. Since disinformation has no verifiable consequences from the scientific standpoint on the behavior of people, it doesn't mean that they are not relevant or they do not have an effect. So here, talking about this research study from the United States with this very interesting essay. They say that the risk of misinformation is not that this is going to affect the immediate behavior or it's going to influence the audience that is available at that moment, but that has implications on the democratic rules. That's why we distinguish the first order effects from the second order effects. The first order effect would be the influence on our pattern of political perceptions, our political behavior. And the second order effects are weakening these fundamental myths from democracy. We could talk about myth, and that could seem to be something that is negative, but it shouldn't be understood this way. In science, it's very common for us to talk about constructions that concern myths and their importance for democracy. For instance, what the people want, this is a myth, because it's not the people who want. The people is not an actor. Nevertheless, for our self-understanding, for our democratic view, and for our national view, it's important for us to keep these myths and maintain them alive. So this myth that they've kind of sees as being weakened by this disinformation campaign is the myth of this attentive audience. And in fact, this is an interesting construction. The politicians, they assume, they suppose that the audience is listening to them because they are doing something. So they believe that they should be held accountable concerning the promises that they made during the electoral period. So they also believe that they break the rules, they will suffer consequences. They won't be elected, so they should behave. That's what Dave Karp was trying to describe with this thesis and with the attack against the democratic myth. And the other thesis is that if the politicians can lie without suffering consequences, without being punished, as Trump is doing right now, and nobody is acting upon that, and they are not complying the electoral promises, so this myth of the attentive people, attentive audience, it will be debunked. So in other words, Karp sees this danger of misinformation campaigns in what concerns democracy, that the myths that are the supporters of democracy are being debunked, and with that you remove the legitimacy of the system, because the legitimacy of the system is attacked by the disinformation campaigns. So this idea is very good, very smart, and I'd like to expand this concept. So I'm going to take this idea and I'm going to use that. Some authors, they say that democratic constitutions generate trust when they are able to institutionalize the mistrust. What does that mean? We have constitutions, we have the division of powers, we have elections, and that way the constitutions are able to end the mistrust from people concerning the politics. Because there shouldn't be any power abuse, because we have strong institutions, because the constitutions have different instruments to deal with that, to fight that. So we are able to state that if the politics is behaving in a wrong way, we can go to the courts. We have this constitutional court, we have a Supreme Court. So I can abstain to vote in this politicians. So there are different tools to deal with the politicians and with politics. So if people do not trust those politicians anymore, they have instruments. That was the first level. Now the second order, now we have this risk that this kind of fault and mistrust is institutionalized. So people do not believe anymore in the courts. They don't think they are represented and they are defended by the courts. And they don't believe that there is this strong division of powers in order to punish the violations and offenses. So I would say, yes, this thesis is from my colleague Karf, but we have many more dangers. We don't only have the myths debunking, but we have other risks if we are not able to integrate this mistrust that in itself, this is healthy, but it shouldn't be excessive. So this is a second order effect that could emerge with disinformation campaigns. When people believe that the politicians are fooling us, we are being manipulated. So these are general statements, but if they become a fad, they can institutionalize the distrust, disseminating mistrust. This is my thesis. Now, to conclude, I'll be brief. We have the acting options. There are more plans of actions, but most of you know that this is the self-regulation of the platforms. We also have the different initiatives from WhatsApp, considering the Bolsonaro president, and also Facebook, limiting the access of different politicians. They've blocked some accounts, some posts were deleted. They are not able to forward messages anymore. This is self-regulation. And we also have the common standards from the platforms. These are standards and rules that are always updated every week, practically. We have new rules, complementary rules, and also the platforms, they use artificial intelligence to fight the disinformation campaigns. And they also use the AI to identify and eliminate these campaigns. So they are looking not only at the content, but they are analyzing the sources from where the messages come, if they are from American origin, or if they come from Russia, or wherever they're coming from. And they combine different processes, different approaches. They use automatic processes to remove the disinformation campaign from their platforms. So they have limited success. It's like the fountain fable with this race between the rabbit and the turtle. And another method is identifying. We see in this campaign in the United States, fake news, they receive these tags. They are small labels, and they say that the source is not trusted and this is a doubtful information. So they call the attention of people not to forward that information. And if they do forward, they must be aware that there was this tag warning them. This is the self-regulation of the platforms, and we also have state measures, we have legislative measures. So in the short term, there are rules to regulate content. So there's a lot of work being developed in this field, including here in Brazil. We've received constant information from you, and there are many updates. It's not easy to follow up that. In Germany, we have SDG on the internet, and we are now reviewing this framework on the internet. We also have this law that is analyzing the media platforms, social media platforms. So mass content that is produced must respect certain standards of pluralism that is demanded by law, and they must be transparent, considering the classification and triage and dissemination. These are short-term measures. At the long run, I believe it's important that we develop this resilience, this individual and national resilience, because I believe that we won't have this mass communication that is being curated as we used to have in the past at the newspapers and TV newscasts. So the democracies, some of them are more susceptible to attacks and others are less susceptible. So we could have this active surveillance. We should have this broad access, and that varies from country to country. We have this educational system that is helping a lot. And on national level, what does it mean to be resilient? Where we have pluralism on different medias, that is helpful. In Brazil, the zero rating for the internet access, what does it mean, the zero rating? Many people have no access. There's no universal access to the internet. Some parts of the internet are available, and this is not good when we want to have plural information. And that is important for the future, to have business models that can guarantee the production of media material that is quality media material. So this is a problem for all of us. The golden era of mass communication is over. We need new business models that can guarantee this high quality in terms of production of information, in terms of communication, and the access to the internet shouldn't be reduced to zero rating content that is for free, that is diminishing the data package. So I come to an end. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Hoffman. We have 15 minutes for the Q&A, for the questions. We've received some questions from the audience. So I'd like to go back to one aspect that you've approached on your talk. I have this personal interest in that. So what is the role of the mass communication and media? We have this constant struggle. They want attention and they have to compete with social media. And on social media, we have a new player. We don't know which path it's going to be. So how the role of traditional media is changing with the ascension of social media. There are very interesting studies, such as the Reuters Institute that is headquartered in Oxford. They study that constantly, this interaction, this mix of competition and cooperation between classical media outlets. And what's clear is that the traditional media outlets that want to reach the newer generations, they are forced to show their content on the platforms, and they have to comply to the rules of the platforms, at least for some extent. So we notice that the mass media are selling their content. So it's click-based. In English, they call it clickbaits. So sometimes the headlines are not related to the content. So sometimes they are adapting to this new fad to be able to reach their audience. Now we have a question from our followers. This is a question by Ana Guedes, and it has to do with the representativeness or the lack of representativeness for the traditional audience concerning the representativeness gap in this public digital media. Is there a difference? Yes, there's a difference. We have to consider that the traditional public space was based on what was considered relevant by the different outlets. So we have this gender dimension, and we also have we see that when we watch the TV newscasts. In Germany, we see men getting out of their Mercedes-Benz. It's very selective. So everyone is smiling. So, of course, there's this selection, and this is valid for all the journalism, all the message disseminations. In Germany, we were scared with this new dimension of the far right. We haven't seen that being depicted by the traditional journalism. So the extremes were able to find out the internet very soon, and they benefited from that. Both extremes, they were only talking about themselves inside their own bubbles, and the traditional outlets, they were left behind. They are reflecting the society with content that is curated, but that doesn't mean that this image is more objective, because we are always seeing selected people. We have to rely on the selection of these people. And people don't want to express their opinion anymore because they are afraid of suffering with the hate speech, for instance. We have another question from the audience, and it has to do with these opinions from the far ends that we find on social media. So they use the different platforms to reach people. So the question is, Professor Hoffman, what political opinions, extreme political opinions and intolerance is also misinformation? Or what would be the distinction to be made? Extremism, hate, opinion, is there a limit, especially on social media? There's an overlap between people who disseminate hate speech, and with that, they are supporting disinformation campaign. This is possible, but I wouldn't say this is the same. I tried to define what is misinformation in my presentation. So these are statements that are going to manipulate, and who is disseminating, they know this is wrong, that is not true. But with hate speech, it's not the same. It's just smearing someone. If I'm saying things about you, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, but just that I'm smearing you. Another question that is very interesting, this comes from this anonymous participator. He's saying that, could you please speak louder, Professor? I'll try to speak louder, Mr. Bruvla says. Socrates was a critical or better saying, in the democracy, everyone has a voice. Should we also question the equality on the internet? This is very interesting, but at the same time, this is very sad, because this way we would question democracy. That's a myth. The greater the participation, the greater the public discourse, that would be good for democracy. That would strengthen democracy, because everyone is able to participate. But now we notice that it's not exactly like that, because democracy is attacked when everyone is able to participate. I haven't seen an article about this theory on democracy that came to a conclusion, but I don't think that the conclusion should be that we should go back to this model that only a few journalists would pronounce themselves. No. As I've mentioned in my final remarks, I want resilience, not to have this selective orators and so on. I want quality. I want quality news. That is going to fight misinformation. We want a well-instructed audience, well-educated, that is able to form their own opinion. Great, excellent. Another question, it comes from Mr. Westland from the Embassy, and I'm going to read it in English. I think it's better than, okay. A gente tem, você tem algum exemplo forte que tenha sucesso? Sim, aqui no Brasil temos here in Brazil we also have the option to discuss about that. The Brazilians were also surprised that a congressman that is not very well known was elected the president. And I think that it has to do with the arrest of Lula right before the elections. Is Bolsonaro in fact a winner? Would Bolsonaro win if Lula was not arrested? We don't know. But these very simple comparisons blaming WhatsApp or blaming the platform X or Y, this is simplifying too much. These are speculations because we don't have enough data about this new phenomenon. Thank you very much, Professor Hoffman. And with that, I'll pass to the next panel. We will have 5 minutes for each one of them, for them to present their own opinion, their knowledge about this topic. Let's start with Rosana Pinheiro Machado. She's a professor of international development at the Department of Social Studies in the University of Bath in the United Kingdom, and she's also a fellow in the Academy of the United Kingdom. She's also the main investigator in this project, no longer a middle class. She is a professor of Oxford University, and also she's a visiting researcher in Harvard, and she's also a pioneer in this research, this field research in China. She has published many different books, and today she's analyzing the Brazilian crisis and the ascension of the far right and the possible routes of escape. And she's also a columnist at the portal The Intercept. Thank you so much for your participation, Professor. You have the floor now. Thank you very much for your introduction, for the mediation. I'd like to thank the invitation of Professor Marco and the speech of Professor Hoffman. It's a great pleasure to be here with my colleagues, and I admire too much this debate that is so important, and I hope this is the first of many. Today, when I was talking with Professor Marcus about what to talk about, my first reaction was, I'm an ethnographist, I'm an anthropologist, and I've been studying this possible idea on this democratic crisis from the standpoint of common people, not because of big data and not because of extreme people. I'm going to tell very quickly what happened and what I did, because so you can understand from my standpoint. I'm an anthropologist. I was working in this project about this inclusion through consumption at the Lula era. This is a research study with my colleague Lucy Scalp that started in 2009. Our objective was to evaluate in the long run which effects we could find in this process of politicization or democratization or harming the politicization or democratization. I won't talk about the results of this research study because it would be a long discussion, but this is the longest research study, longitudinal speaking. But the fact is that we are back to this field. The research study started in 2009. my colleague and I, we came back to this field research in this peripheral community in Porto Alegre in 2016, and we found this generation of interlocutors. We've been following up since 2009.
2009 that was beneficiary of the programs of Bolsa Familia, inclusion by consumption, and during the peak of the economic crisis, they were transformed into voters. Many of them were in love with the image of Bolsonaro already in 2016. So that was the research that we developed. We followed a localized community, a very specific but very paradigmatic community. It was somehow the birthplace of the participatory budget in Porto Alegre, which was the peripheral area of Porto Alegre in the east part. This period of politicization in the 1990s ended up being decreased throughout the process of inclusion by consumption, but the process that we saw was not that linear. We couldn't say that the inclusion by consumption brought this politicization. It is much more complex than that. There were layers of politicization, depolitization, and democratization. And at that moment, we found a big part of the men unemployed in the middle of the economic crisis that had their lives improved and that they bought their houses in the Lula administration, and now they are adhering to the image of Bolsonaro and producing content, sometimes with very old cell phones, buying SIM cards on the newsstands, producing videos and uploading them to YouTube as a way to perform activism. They are in classes C and D that started adhering in 2016 to the image of what they called the myth, which was Bolsonaro. And then we started a new phase of the longitudinal research, which was observing how everything had happened. And remembering that we were in 2016 in a deep economic crisis, that is a very neglected variable in the public debate when we talk about the ascension of Bolsonarism. So the process of disinformation and Bolsonarism happened in a moment of deep disillusion and unemployment, loss of purchasing power, a deep disillusion with the politics itself and the image of the Labour Party of PT because of all of the repercussion of the car wash operation, which was a spectacle. In the process of disbelief, as Professor Hoffman was saying, disbelief in any and every politician. For us, Brazilian social scientists, this process of deep disbelief in the most popular layers of society is very common. So we were in an economic crisis, a political crisis, a crisis of public security, especially in Porto Alegre in the southern part of Brazil. The little that people was able to acquire in the Lula administration, they would lose it overnight. So all of our participants had very relevant, violent episodes of vulnerability. And there was also an existential crisis. It was a moment of a social limbo in the country. People didn't have jobs, they didn't have a place to stay. There was an increase of the youth and feminism, and there were some people that felt like they were in a historical vacuum. People used to report an existential crisis. We call in our papers this is the crisis of being people. People lost their place in the world during that period. So what I want to mention in that context, and I'm going to try to be brief because I think the most important part is our discussion here, but I'm going to discuss two paradoxes that we find in the field regarding democracy. It has been a very long research, a localized research, but very long longitudinal research, and I'm going to mention two aspects related to the democratic discussion because it has more to do with this debate. The first thing, of course, is that in the middle of that social and economic vacuum that I mentioned, and in the middle of this existential crisis, we know that the image of a man who is a savior will have a very strong role. So we have a 100% of adhesion from our participants to the idea of a man that is different than what they had so far. People used to say, I don't like him, I think he's radical, but we have to change what is happening. So we need to have a change. And at the same time, there was this idea of this common enemy, which is part of the modus operandi of this whole process of outreach via social media. The paradox I would like to talk about is when we reached the research in 2016, we could see an adhesion in social media from young men and driving app drivers, security guards, that related to the armed figure of Bolsonaro. So the figure of the weapon is key to this point. It's the savior, the armed savior that is going to put this place in order. But this started little by little, and when we reached the moment of the election, when we did a more intensive research and an immersion in our field work, what we found was a different speech by people. People used to say that it's the first time that they were doing politics in their lives. It's the first time I'm doing politics in my life for love. It's the first time that I am falling in love with politics. So that's it's the same speech that we saw in the social media, that people that said that they are the social bots of Bolsonaro. During the campaign in the last 2 months especially, there was a huge existential identity. Recovering from that existential crisis that I was talking to you about earlier, they had a feeling of belonging. They had a feeling that they belonged to the campaign by Bolsonaro, that they were becoming political subjects. For those who followed, I was the one who followed those same people in the process of participatory budget, discussing an agenda, and at that moment, that was a very depoliticized political relationship. They felt like they were part of a bigger thing, but in Bolsonaro's election, they felt like Bolsonaro knew their name. It is the title of one of the papers that I wrote, Bolsonaro Knows My Name. It is not only about discussing for 5 hours with the community, but it's about having a man who puts the house in order. We saw this process for 3 years of people making their own news and making their own videos. And when we talk about the public debate, it's very hard to have an ethnographic voice to the debate. Professor Hoffman was talking about this. The speech of the public debate is always top down. It's always an idea of manipulation. But in more comprehensive contexts that have to do with other socioeconomic variables, favor a process of people as agents of those news and makers of those news. I call it a paradox because it is a process of democratization of the political process. People are doing their campaigns without charging anything, but it was not a collective effort. It only had the image of one man. I would like to speak about another paradox on how these same people that never did politics, that always saw the state as something absent, as something that didn't exist, that didn't reach the slums. There's so many stories that we're trying to get established in Brazil, and those people are occupying those democratic places to react to the news that they received. For example, if a person knew about a teacher, a Marxist teacher that was going to influence the minds of their children that could become an LGBT person because of that teacher, that person, that father or that mother, they used the democratic places that were never interesting to them. They called the university's dean's office. They activated the public defender's office or the public prosecution's office. There were a lot of people calling the public prosecution's office in the last few years to censor someone. So people that saw the state as something very distant to the democratic instances, they start occupying those instances to cause censorship, by the way. When I was a teacher, a professor actually in Brazil, I was a target of many complaints and investigations in the public prosecutor's office. So that second paradox of a process of searching for censorship and fighting for a narrative through democratic institutions was something very common. And I would like to wrap up. I don't want to be very long. I think the most interesting thing here is the debate. I was very happy with Professor Hoffman's speech. I was very enthusiastic actually because I was thinking about starting this speech mentioning that I was going to swim against the tide, but the professor's speech contemplates those aspects. The experiments cannot be generalized, but we can provide insights to think about a more complex reality on how the news and the disinformation are present in our social context and are elaborated in our social context, because the speech of manipulation, top-down manipulation, can be very applicable to the political debate. But for the academic debate, it does not explain all of the variables that are found in the process, the economic crisis, the public security crisis, and all of the context aspects like the stabbing of Bolsonaro, the arrest of Lula, and now we can say the emergency fund. So this is another event. It was first Bolsonaro's stabbing and then Lula's arrest, and now the emergency funds for the COVID-19 pandemic. We have to take that all into account and understand how those news are experienced and elaborated on a daily basis. I have trouble presenting this ethnological aspect in a public debate because the audience is going to be more satisfied if I talk about fake news, if I talk about the cabinet of hate, the hate office, and the WhatsApp messages. But I would like to mention the idea of how much we were analyzing this in the youth since 2016, and the youth saying that they were involved in the political process for the first time. For us who consider an authoritarian project, there are contradictions in this process. It is very important for those young people to see themselves as political agents. We can have a long discussion on inequalities and the way that those news reach people. But another thing we have to do is confessing that people have a blank mindset and they're going to receive some news and they're going to follow the news just for follow-up research. What we saw during the distribution of the emergency funds with the same people already disbelieve Bolsonaro. They are receiving news about Bolsonaro, but many of them still say that they will vote for Bolsonaro again. So they are part of the 30% that said that they will vote for Bolsonaro again. But at the same time, they disagree with Bolsonaro in many aspects, especially with the emergency measures during the pandemic. I'm not talking about the radicalized Bolsonarist groups. There are people who study these groups. There are many scholars who study the radical groups. I'm talking about regular people who are not radical and who still have a process during the reading of those news. We saw a very clear process in rejecting the government propaganda because people in the community were dying, and they still said, but I would vote for him because of this and that, and the Labor Party cannot be in office again. But it's a construction of a very complex political self that sometimes is abandoned in the public debate because they assume people are manipulated and they don't stop to understand how those people are political agents. And this process of news constitutes a community. And on the other hand, these are people with several nuances, and it is possible to search for spaces of negotiation and resilience. I'm going to wrap it up. I tried to bring a few points and insights for the debate based on the research, and then we can discuss more during the debate. Thank you very much, Professor. It was very interesting, especially this contact with the people, with the public. It is something that I, myself as a journalist, is interested in. Very interesting how the economic situation can also be a factor. I think that the decisive factor in the process of elections, or in that aspect, and then that scenario, is not considered very important, even though it is. Even though there's evidence all over the world that inequality or crisis impacts, of course, there is evidence that is not very explored in the public debate. Now we will continue with Professor Wilson Gomes. He is the running professor of communication theory in the Federal University of Bahia. He is a researcher and professor in the program of post-graduation in contemporary communication and the coordinator of the National Institute of Science and Technology in Digital Democracy that involves the Federal University of Bahia and other 19 institutions of higher education in Brazil and 23 international higher education institutions. Welcome, Professor Wilson Gomes. The floor is yours. Thank you for being here. First of all, I would like to thank the German Embassy in Brazil and DAPP, represented by Professor Marco Hudaga. Thank you for inviting me to be here. The embassy invited us last year to go to Germany and get to know the digital democracy projects in Germany. So we've been there and that was when we met Professor Janet Hoffman, who received us in the Weissenbaum Institute in Berlin, and we had a very joyful morning of discussions. I would also like to greet Professor Janet Hoffman. Thank you very much for speaking to us in Brazil. It's a pleasure to hear you from Brazil this time. Professor Rosana Pinheiro Machado, who I admire very much. Very nice presentation. Jack Bruville, our host here, and Marc Hudiger, who is going to speak after me. It's a pleasure to be here today. I have been speaking very much about fake news since the pandemic started. I started by talking in the investigation of fake news in the government of São Paulo, and from then on I haven't stopped. The first semester of 2020 is the semester of fake news. This is the general topic, and there is a specific reason for that. I have noticed in the last few years, I have put together an international bibliography of scientific papers on fake news, and until June 2020, I have over 1,000 papers published between 2016 and 2020. The science of fake news started in 2016 and it reached its peak in 2020. But only the first semester of 2020, we have 20% of the bibliography published. But the reason is not political. The reason is the pandemic. There was a convergence of two topics. The pandemic, or the infodemic of fake news, connected to the pandemic of coronavirus. In 2016, in the world, and in 2018 in Brazil, people were desperate with fake news, especially because of the political effects. There are terrible situations in which people make badly informed political decisions. But in 2020, people understood that the problem was not only in politics. The problem was in our own social lives. Because fake news not only for you to make choices during the elections, but you can make bad decisions on public health. They are denying the existence of the virus, inventing medications that are not scientifically controlled. They were attacking the reputation and the image of institutions like the WHO, sabotaging prevention measures. So everybody was afraid of the fake news, and it's not only about politics and political communication. In 2020, of course, before we had the anti-vaccine movement, which has a lot to do with fake news, but in 2020, it became a problem of public health as well. Everybody was appalled by fake news because fake news does not make you only make bad decisions politically, but it can influence your health. I chose two aspects to discuss with you today in those 12 minutes that I still have. Professor Janet Hoffman was speaking and I was thinking here, I think it's very important to make clear that we work on this perspective, we do international comparisons, and the social and political effects, the democratic effects, electoral effects, and even effects on public health in the different countries can be very diverse. Fake news may not have a decisive effect in the German elections, but it does have a decisive effect in the Brazilian elections, Indian, Mexican, American elections, and also in the public life. Because in certain countries, people decide to use chloroquine, for example, massively, and in other countries they don't. So for what reason? I think some factors should always be taken into consideration. for a future agenda of the international effects of fake news. First of all, we need to discuss the penetration of the internet, the amount of people who are connected. Today, most of the population is connected, even in Brazil, which is a country with violent social exclusion. Digital exclusion is a lot smaller than social exclusion in Brazil. Everybody can have access to the internet somehow. The second is the level of engagement of people in digital social media. What is the level of engagement? How many people use Facebook in Germany? We're not going to get to 10%. So how many people use Facebook daily in Brazil? You have a vast majority of the population who uses Facebook or WhatsApp. The use of WhatsApp to make politics. The third thing would be the level of platformization of the political sphere. The political reality is not happening in other spaces like academic spaces or cafes and intellectualized spaces like newspapers, and the public sphere was transferred to the digital platforms where people join their ideas, converge ideas, interpretations are discussed, narratives on the facts are discussed. So what is the level of platformization in Brazil and in Germany? That is a key point. In Brazil, we have a very high level. Most of the public debate today happens in platforms, with influence or not of the journalism and the intellectuals, people horizontally or horizontal and vertical relationships, but most of the things happen in platforms. The fourth thing is the level of political knowledge or political training or political education, whatever that may be. The average Brazilian, the average German, the average American, what level of information and political training they have. They understand that the Supreme Court cannot be ruled by the President of the Republic, that the General Prosecutor of the Republic has a different role than the federal auditor. This makes a lot of difference. What is Parliament versus the President? Does the President know everything? Why are there three powers? For us, those information seem obvious, but they are not obvious at all. We have to understand how many people understand some key notions of politics. The fifth one would be the level of trust of people and the political institutions. Not only political institutions, but the politics itself and the politicians themselves and journalism as an institution and journalists and science and professors, intellectuals. This level of trust is very important. There are some people who have 100% of trust in the political institutions, but that would be a society of idiots. We don't expect 100%, but we expect a level of trust. We had several episodes in the Brazilian history, impeachment, the movements of 2013, the social turmoil that we had zeroed the trust of people in political institutions. The level of trust in journalism in Brazil and in Germany is so different. I talk about reference journalism. What is the level of trust that people have in journalism? As a referee of the facts, as a tool that tells us what are the true facts and what in fact happened. That is a very important element. Trust in intellectuals, and science, and professors, those are key elements for the society. Do we recognize those people as gatekeepers? Scientists as gatekeepers of science? If you want a truer interpretation of the phenomena, political phenomena, you should listen to someone who studies this topic. The sixth one is the level of polarization of the society. How much social hate moves people? How much distance groups have from one another? It is natural, and several positions are natural in the pluralism, political pluralism. But the political center disappears somehow, and there are far left and far right people. When information is no longer information, a cognitive element that I use to guide myself in the world, when information can become a weapon. There's the weaponization of information. This transformation of information into weapons is a favorable environment to do the interpretation of fake news, for example.
One, the value of the tribal information, what is coming from this polarization. There's this fragmentation, meaning it doesn't mean that each group is going to go to a different side, but it means that people are building different tribes with different values, with different ends, with different capital, with ways of accumulating values, and with charismatic value leaders as well. So it's a social tribal process, the relationship between people and their identity leaders. Naturally, we cannot explain the phenomenon of fake news in Brazil and the United States without understanding this tribal effect of the right wing. It's occupying this place in this ideological spectrum. This is defining people. You don't vote for Bolsonaro, you are Bolsonaro. You don't vote for Trump, you are Trump. At this precise moment when you are Trump or Bolsonaro, the use of the information as a weapon is something that is key. If the leader says chloroquine, then I trust chloroquine. If the leader says get a vaccine, I will get a vaccine. If the leader says don't get a vaccine, I won't get a vaccine. So this is the level of the tribal identity, and that works the same way with the left wing. The left wing groups also behave like that. And lastly, I think that this is connected to what Rosanna was talking about, her last point, is the proportion of these new super participants, the hyper engaged people who are participate in everything, who is disputing political stances as their lives were at risk. If I don't do what I have to do, something very serious is going to happen in the world. If we do not react against the homosexuals, we who are the few heterosexuals in the world, the homosexuals will take into power, and it will be mandatory to become a homosexual. So this is the kind of idea that they feed, that transform this majority of heterosexual people that feels that is a minority that is surrounded by ferocious homosexuals. So this is a game. So they are engaged. They are like that tribe that is surrounded by enemies by in all sides. So that's why they have to wake up to dispute the interpretations, to to disseminate the hate speech on social media, because they are the right, they are the patrol against the attack of different groups. They feel the attack like that. So we had in Brazil this new generation of super participants. I understand what Professor Hoffman says. We are from the same generation. We are in this generation of people who has always regretted the diminishing the political participation and the civil engagement of in politics. It happens everywhere, but we want a society with more participation, because participation will produce democracy. So it happened in Brazil, but it also happened in other parts of the world, that everyone decided to participate in politics at the same time. But there's a time for us to learn about participation. We all normally participate in trade unions, in political parties, in intellectual settings, that where we are able to discuss the possibilities, to remain skeptical. We have to withdraw judgment until we have more information. We should judge only based on facts. But for these participants, it's different. It's a popcorn participation. You put that into the microwave and you're ready to participate. Because what they need is not information, it's not to learn, is not to understand the Republican society. What they need is emotion, is engagement, is blood, is sweat, is giving their hearts and fighting in the middle of the game. This is the new participant. This is the perfect setting for this super participation and for what's happening right now. Because participation demands time and demands skill. But this participation won't come from the traditional settings in politics, trade unions, and political parties. They are people who were found in the field, as Rosanna has presented in her research study. They are on digital settings, digitally mediated environment of communication. So that's what we have to understand to understand the dissemination of fake news and conspiracy theories, because people are engaged in all of that, including hate speech and so on. So this is the perfect environment, and these are the 8 steps that I would suggest to be taken into account when we compare different countries on the subject of fake news. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor. The time is almost up. We have to pass the floor to Marco Aurelio Rudiger, the director of the Department of Public Policy Analysis at FGV. He's one of the organizers. His PhD in sociology, and as I've mentioned before, he's the director of the Department of Public Policy Analysis at FGV, and his main fields of interest are sociology and democracy, and the connection with social media, the society on social media, and the new technologies. Professor, thank you very much for organizing this webinar and for participating on this webinar. Unfortunately, Professor Hoffman has to leave at noon. She has another conference, and unfortunately, she won't be able to follow up this webinar. in this discussion. Thank you so much, Professor, for your participation. I'd like to thank Professor Hoffman and Professor Rosana Pinheiro Machado, who was so kind to come to this meeting. We are friends, we've met before. I was very much impressed by their presentations, and it's even hard to add something to what they said. But I will try and bring this discussion for this current moment. And of course, I'd like to thank the German Embassy in Brazil, and they've been helping us a lot with this webinar. And also, we have this partnership with HPT, that is a center that I direct. So we've been partners for a long time. We have ambitious projects and very exciting processes at the same time, projects at the same time. Today, in Brazil, something interesting happened. In the morning, I was organizing myself for this debate, and I had the opportunity to see this interview with the Justice Luiz Roberto Barroso from the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in Brazil is presided by the justices. And we're going to have an election in the municipalities in Brazil for the mayors. So it's an intermediate election between the president election and the Justice Barroso is going to preside the electoral Supreme Court this year. And he gave an interesting interview to a news outlet today. And he has a very high rep. He's a quality justice. Everyone admires him. But in the interview, the interviewer asked about elections. They were talking about the pandemic, and at the end, they had this discussion on fake news and misinformation. And the justice, to my surprise, he has an optimist view about the complexity that we've been dealing with, that Professor Hoffman brought to the discussion, Professor Rosanna and Professor Wilson as well, because we are dealing with this very articulated process that is very deep, not only in this objective architecture to establish misinformation, but it has deep consequences in the life of the common citizen and in their integration in society. And in several ways, talking about symbols, participations, and the services that the citizens receive, and all the constructions that they do in the world, and how these narratives are rebuilt concerning and reprocessed by the social media to have this identity connection and to judge the world. So the common citizen doesn't have to be such a knower of, such knowledgeable about politics, because they have to make this important decision, that is his or her vote, and they use this data that they are able to get, this understanding from the reality, and with the emotions that they deal with in the network. Because the network, this internet network deals with symbols and emotions. So it's quite a complex problem. And I saw that in this interview with the justice, because he said that the platforms are taking action. They are being prepared for this political process that he expected that would be a clean election, that people would play clean during the election period. And somehow I thought that this does not this is not the reality of the social media and the internet, because we've been studying since 2013 everything that has happened in the country concerning the internet. And of course, we cannot explain the far right coming to power only with the action of WhatsApp. I believe that you all agree with me. But it's very concerning that the institutions cannot understand very clearly what's happening today. Yesterday, in reality, at this webinar, the speaker of the lower house and the congressmen who were here, they were talking about this legislation to curb fake news, and it seemed to me that they had this clearer notion about the reality, because they have to deal with this universe of misinformation and the construction of the democratic society, and they are seeing other distorted narratives overlapping with that, with this end of undermining democracy itself. So I agree with the reference that was brought by the Professor Hoffman about the second order effects, because we have to observe that. And we should observe that in a deeper way, in a long-term way. So what I wanted to mention, and I'll try to be very brief to leave time for further discussion, the networks, they operate on feelings. They don't have this very practical view. So I think that the electoral superior court has been having difficulties to understand this new situation, because the norm won't explain these new sociologic processes and political processes that are much more complex and less normatizing than the court imagines. But I think that the court should be attentive and should understand that in a deeper way, because otherwise Brazil will have problems with its democracy, because it's becoming more and more structural in time, because there's this engineering of disinformation. I cannot say that WhatsApp elected this personality, but in reality, it has used references from the concrete world in order to rebuild from specific narratives this speech model that is operating in subjective levels of the culture and in the understanding of people in their common role as citizens. So hatred, for instance, it's something that is useful on social media. It's not something that we can not take into account. It's part of this narrative construction. So although there's this right of expressing your thoughts, there's this limit of tolerance that should be better understood. And to suppress this discussion, it's very convenient and easy. We should delve deeper in this discussion. It's not a matter of curbing the freedom of expression, but we cannot overlap the limit of tolerance. So how we cannot be tolerant with lies that are allowing this undermining of democracy. The democracy that is allowing the citizen to express himself or herself. So we have to try to understand more deeply this process. So hatred, it's a useful factor in this construction, and And Wilson and Hosanna brought this other important point that is also building this identity. It's trying to recompose this place at the world, especially when people are scared about globalization, about their jobs. Today in Brazil, we have 13 millions of unemployed. This is a great impact anywhere in the world. So people don't believe anymore about politics and what politics can change in their lives. But the problem is not only unemployment and the economy. What we are talking about is something else. What is the place of this unemployed person in this labor market that is emerging, not the one that is gone? And from that, they have to think how much they were affected by several different factors. So the system is not supporting me. So I'm going to vote against the system. And who is against the system? Someone who has a hate speech based on this construction. So the hatred is useful, and the identity is also important in this equation, and also the personalization, in which the social media, and Rosanna talked about that quite well, the possibility of feeling this direct link with this leadership. So the hatred, the identity crisis, and the personalization of this leadership generates this environment that is prone to go against society, to go against democracy. But we scholars, we cannot admit that, because it's very hard to go back. So it's very impressive to suppose that a simple conversation with the platforms is able to disrupt that, or that we can simply ask people to play clean during an election process in this very small campaign, trying to elucidate what fake news is, when fake news is something very complicated. And when you're talking about big fake news, you have to understand what you're disseminating. So I see here a very serious problem, and I'll try to be faster now, but I believe that we have to imagine that although we are not completely defining the electoral results with the fake news, of course it's influencing with this hatred speech, the identities, with the personalization, and they're trying to bring this citizen who is not a political citizen to to swing from left to right and from right to left. So politics has has been establishing this political debate in order to press their supporters to use the hate speech against the opposition. So we've been seeing this use that is rebuilding this discourse, aiming at the next elections and even the president elections in 2022. And I'm very concerned about what's going to happen in Brazil. And at the same time, I'm an optimist. When I see the statements from the Congress representatives who are very attentive to these issues. So I'll try to give more time for discussion. So I'd like to thank my colleagues, and I'd like to listen from them so that we can debate afterwards. Thank you so much, Professor. So let's start our Q&A session. It's noon already. It's time to wrap up, but I hope that we can go on a little further, because it's very interesting to have this discussion. And I would like to ask you to give short answers so that we are able to have this dynamics and this fast dynamics and this discussion. I'm going to start with this question. from one of the participants, one of the viewers. He is Aldo Arantes, and he's questioning what is the relationship between misinformation and the cultural war, the construction of this hegemony of the right-wing ideas. In my opinion, it's not only about the far right, but this cultural war that is happening on social media in the United States, but also here in Brazil. Around this administration that has this idea that there's this cultural war that is, and they're talking about globalism and establishment. So what is the relationship between that? Maybe Professor Rosanna can start, because you said you have to leave soon, right? This is a hard question because it's very long to answer. It's hard to answer that because it's one of the topics that is more interesting to me, in fact. There's a direct relationship, in my opinion. If I'm using misinformation to feed this cultural war. It's a very diverse war. There are many wars, many religious groups that are organized since the 90s, at least in the far right. Many groups in the American far right and the Brazilian far right. But in summary, they have this single character in common, that is this apocalyptical vision of the world. So they have this vision of the apocalypse due to globalists, due to the gay dictatorship. So they have this very flexible construction of this enemy, and they say that they are going to destroy the civilizations. That's why they have to have this huge apparatus to say that they are destroying the world due to the Chinese vaccine, or or inventing the pandemic so that China is able to dominate the market. So there's this direct relationship with the cultural war. You could leave your mics on so that you can debate at the same time. Hosanna, I think that your arguments are fundamental. This cultural war started with Gramsci, with the left wing. They have designed the organic intellectuals that are linked to Bandel Chow from the proletariat, with this worldview that came from the proletariat, and the use of journalism to build a new culture, new mentalities, new values that could be socially shared. That was the vision of Gramsci. And now the far wing is using that and inserting other elements that were not put in the cultural war. And to be honest, that was ambiguous, and it became even worse because in this case you have resource for transforming your enemy into Satan. So you have the social memory, and you use resources in campaigns of misinformation and lie. So that would be the cultural war in this far right version. I'm sorry, Gramsci, for what's happening today in Brazil and in the world. I'm sorry for Gramsci as well. I'd like to add something. The problem here is that the far right in Brazil adopts that. It's important that as a strategy for building their discourse, not only to get out of the closet, so to speak, because They were tired about their role in the past. They saw that there was this opportunity to consolidate their own identity, but they had to take over a discourse. So they had to build this worldview, and from this confrontation of ideas, from this contradictory in the democratic structure, but in a radical way, because the other is an enemy and I have to win against them in this election within this democratic construction and I should design policies concerning that. So everyone that don't agree with my view, they don't have to wait for the election to build new views. They have to remove from public life my enemies. That's why it's anti-democratic, this kind of discourse. And for that, they use absurd arguments, trying to put one side, to pull center segments and radical segments, such as the evangelical audience. And they are not all the same, I know, but some of them are very radical. And some with this bias of far right that is close to fascism. So they're trying to put everyone together in this curious narrative, and this is very disruptive because it doesn't make sense. And the country is paying a very high price due to that. That's what I wanted to say. We've talked about the accountability of politics and communication means, and we've talked about justice and so on when it comes to fake news and misinformation. So what is the role of education, especially in Brazil, where we have an educational system that is not as good as the educational system in Germany and many other countries in Europe, for instance. Could we partially resolve the problem of misinformation somehow? I'm going to speak briefly first. I think that the pandemic made something very clear. When we talk about Brazil, we have to understand that not all the educational system in Brazil has a lower quality than Europe. We have this educational system that is very unequal and unproportional. We have a minority that has this educational standard of high quality, accessing all the digital media during the pandemic, and we have this large majority with no policy trying to use the learning from the future and the digital formats of studies, and now it's very clear that they are not able to do so, this vast majority. So Brazil is more and more unequal, and this is a great problem. And I don't know if this is changing the issue of misinformation, because we see misinformation happening in several places. It's a cultural issue, identity issue, as I've mentioned before. And on the other hand, we have the civic component that we see problems and failures in practically all of the countries. It's not a Brazilian privilege. You go to Europe and you see hatred groups, far-right groups, organizing themselves and influencing the public discourse and coming to power. It happened in Hungary. We've seen many radical movements, far-right movements with prejudice and feeding hate. So this is not a privilege from Brazil. What happens in Brazil is that we have this very unequal education, that is changing all the possibilities of social ascension and insertion in society. And this is a great problem, and we should approach that. And with that, we have our the civic problems in the curriculum, the Brazilian curriculum that should be emphasized as well, in my opinion. Well, of course, education is a variable. It's an important variable, but it's moderated by other variables that are more decisive. Otherwise, you wouldn't explain phenomena that middle class people in Brazil are taking hydrochloroquine. So the middle class in Brazil is not behaving better than other classes. So the people in Leblon, they not necessarily have resources. And then we have this fake news and misinformation that is happening very much in Italy. I don't know if our situation is worse than in Italy. And that's been happening for 2 decades already. And it's not due to lack of schooling, because there are other factors that are also influencing the level of trust in institutions, in the politics, the faith in democracy, the trust in journalism, the many different elements that should be taken into account. So there's a lot of polarization, and the groups of physicians and lawyers and people in the juridic world in Brazil, they are great disseminators of fake news in Brazil as well. So let's wrap up at 12:15, and to close our webinar, do you have hope on social media and on the internet, because they have created positive effects as well in democracy? We think about the Arab Spring that was decided in many cases. So do we have hope in this platform of hatred that could become a platform of love? I'm going to speak first, because then Rudiger can close the seminar. I have two theses about that. We have a demand for hope at this kind of webinars on fake news, and we understand why. Fake news, they do not happen due to digital platforms. They happen due to people. People use the platforms this way. And something is happening in the world that is taking us to this polarization, for this climate that we are living today. The digital platform is only a means. Everything that can be used to build hatred discourse and authoritarianism can also be used to build democracy, even the digital platforms. Now, we've talked about e-government, and now we're seeing the setback. But to have democracy, we need Democrats. To have tolerance, we need tolerant people. So you need people with democratic convictions occupying all of the spaces, including the digital spaces. You have to have pluralist Democrats that are tolerant, that have trust in the institutions, that advocate the rule of law, that advocate the public discussion to fix the institutions, and they should be present on social media. If the intellectual elite is not going to engage on social media, we won't have a solution. Good Democrats, qualified Democrats, should occupy the digital spaces. I don't have much more to say. I think that William's words, they synthesize what I believe. I think that the academia has this important role to have this critical view, but there's a bias. And my concern is, because we always talk about misinformation, that are a direct subproduct of the far right, but it's not only the far right who is using that. You see the presence of bots in all political fields. So in fact, the internet doesn't have a flag, doesn't have a side. It's a technical instrument, and it's operated and used by different groups with different levels of skills and sophistication. The problem that I see is the critical view of the networks as a potential for consensus and social capital of this utopian view that we've had for some years. And now we are confronting with the sad reality that is dystopic as well. So being utopic or dystopic, if we are going to build an utopia, or if you're going to make this dystopia happen, this will come to the shoulders of the citizens, with the difference that is happening in real time. So this is something important, and unfortunately, there's a lot of sophistication to fool people. So there's an exercise of construction that is proper to our times. And just to wrap up, I would say that the 21st century is fundamental for the democracy, this beginning of the 21st century. So the democratic countries, the countries that have the same problems that we are presenting there, and the non-democratic countries don't have this kind of problem because they control the public debate. So this heritage that we have of democracy, we have to fight for that. But for doing so, we have to understand this phenomenon. We cannot underestimate this phenomenon. It's a complex issue. It's not from this platform that we are going to create a present, and it's not with this set of platform that we are going to dissipate this fog that is happening when we are talking about the public debate on social media. So this is our interest, and the democracies in the world, they have to fight for that. And I'd like to close by saying that it's very important to have this support that we had from the German government, to have this discussion, to develop this work. And other centers are also working for that, Professor Wilson, Professor Rosanna, Professor Janet Hoffman. So these are important places for deepening our researches and also to bring this discussion to society. So we have to consider democracy as this fundamental value that is under attack. Thank you so much. We have to wrap up. Unfortunately, it's a discussion that must go on because it's key to us to discuss about that. It was a great pleasure to talk to you, professors. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you, the audience at home as well. We are going to have another webinar tomorrow afternoon with the participation of other speakers who are also very interesting. The keynote speaker will be the Supreme Court Justice Luis Barroso. And I'd like to thank you for the participation, and I wish you all a good day and